Hey, George.
John, long time no see.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you again.
Yeah.
Looks really, I can see out the window behind you. It looks really nice there in Santa Fe.
Oh, it's beautiful. It's been getting into the high 50s, low 60s, and then cooling into the 40s and high 30s at night. So it's perfect.
Hey, so you've been traveling a lot. I don't know if it's lately or over the last 6 months.
Mostly late last year. The main thing that occupied me until a few days ago was our 22nd annual Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop.
Ah, yes. How'd that go?
It was great. We had a record number of applicants, long waiting list, and I don't know if it's a reaction to Trump and the anti-science, or if it was just a coincidence. But great people. So it just reminded me that we've got to have you back, because that was very fun when you were at the workshop.
Oh, man, anytime. I had a wonderful time when I was there. Hey, I got to ask you, I don't know if it came up, and I know this wasn't on our agenda, but I'm curious to know what you think about the March for Science.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I actually wrote a piece on that for that new online magazine, Undark.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, but I didn't really come down one way or the other. I mean, the big controversy was whether this makes science seem like just another interest group, special interest group. And I kind of sympathized with that argument. But then, when the march actually erupted in all these cities, it was very inspiring. Yeah. And I rather like that. But I understand the people who were queasy about it. And my column was just basically saying I was struck by the photographs of some of the signs in an earlier march that was held in Boston during the AAAS meeting, the American Association for Advancement of Science annual meeting. And they had kind of what seemed to me a dress rehearsal for the science march. And what I liked was a sign that said objective reality exists. And I kind of riffed off that, because that's kind of something you might imagine someone from the cultural conservative right demonstrating against postmodernists and the whole idea that there are only different ways of knowing, and I kind of used that to wrap around to the thing to really march for should be that science is not the truth, capital T, and it's also not just a truth on the same level as many others, but it's the best means we have of kind of honing in on some rough but improving picture of reality. So,
yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. I guess I was.
Yeah.
I guess I was one of the people who was queasy about it. I thought about trying to sort through my misgivings in a column, and then I just decided there were so many people writing about it already. I didn't really have much to contribute, but I was worried about. I've always worried about science as being being perceived as a special interest group, and arguing too aggressively for funding when maybe there are other priorities that are more urgent. And also I figured it might be a little almost hypocritical on my part, because I'm normally sort of bashing science. I'm so critical.
You could have had a sign that said "science, not scientism."
Yeah, that would have been a great sign. And there are so many ironies in the politics of science these days. You're right that you used to be able to sort of align the left and right with, the left was associated with postmodernism, at least in academia traditionally, and the right with kind of an old-fashioned realism. And now that's all topsy-turvy.
Yeah, I mean, going back, that's one thing I got into in this column was, going back to the early days of what's now called intelligent design movement, so-called creation science. And, basically that was a means of creating an alt science.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right.
And then I noted that also happened on the left with some of these. Like there's this Native American activist, Vine Deloria, who wrote a book also really bashing evolutionary theory and the notion that that his people, evolved from animals, and giving more credence to Native American creation myths in which dinosaurs walked with people on the earth. So same thing you would hear from the creationists. So now, it's kind of this breakdown that we've talked about of a consensus that there's such a thing as an objective reality. And maybe there's not, but hypothesis.
It just occurred to me, I saw, that Earl Morris, the great documentary maker, was a student of Thomas Kuhn in the early 70s. And I had read that they didn't get along, and Morris had recalled, this is quite a while ago, in a piece in the New York Times, I think, that Kuhn once threw an ashtray at him because he was irritated with Morris. Well, I just listened to a podcast with Morris recently where he really hated Kuhn. I mean, as a person and as a philosopher, and he basically blames Kuhn for Donald Trump. He thinks that Kuhn's ideas did so much damage to our notions of truth. And scientific truth, but truth in general, that they've kind of paved the way for this crazy period of fake news that we're in right now.
Wow, science. Yeah, you have your paradigm, I have my paradigm, and we all have our paradigms, and they're all equally good. And of course, that's not what Kuhn's point was, or at least he really pushed back about that, right? When people, it was Structure of Scientific Revolutions, his book that really made famous the idea of paradigm. And I mean, his thing was that, when there are these paradigms, this is how science has changed, but he wasn't doing, he wasn't calling for postmodern free-for-all in which, all paradigms are equal.
No, he wasn't. But you can see how people reading his book would interpret it and hear somebody, Earl Morris, who was pretty steeped in Kuhn's writings and who knew the guy, he thought that was a reasonable, that kind of extreme postmodernism was a reasonable extrapolation from Kuhn. I think the whole idea of somebody like Kuhn, this very sophisticated philosopher, having any impact on mass culture and politics is ludicrous.
Pretty cool.
Because, the idea that you have so many little steps of causation to go from the Structure of Scientific Revolution to the insanity that is in Washington right now.
Oh, but
I don't know.
You don't really have to go through those steps, though, do you? I mean, basically, paradigm became a very successful meme, and it replicated and was distorted and embraced in maybe a very distorted way by, people who it was in their political interest to oppose one paradigm, and, secular humanism, which to most of us is kind of this neutral backdrop, and then there's all these religions that contend against our sort of neutral secular point of view, but then you reduce secular humanism to just one more of these paradigms, each in their own little balloon worlds, and then you've kind of done this philosophical jujitsu and anything goes. But then deep down, you don't really believe these are all equal. You believe yours is the one truth. So
that's right.
Yeah,
you use it just to damage the opposition.
And that you could say that about scientism, which you've written a lot about, the idea that science is the truth. But I was trying to make the point that it's not the truth, but it's also not just one more paradigm, equally on an equal level with, say, Native American creation myths and the Big Bang Theory. That really one has a better claim to being closer to the truth, lower T.
Yeah, okay, we're really going off on a digression, and I want to hear about your travels, but But since we're talking about this, I just have to mention, and since you brought up creation myths, I just finished a piece a couple of hours ago on inflation. The theory of how the universe was born, and which has been around for almost 40 years now, and it's very popular. But like string theory, it is has lots of severe problems. It's very difficult or even impossible to test because there's so many versions of it. It's so flexible. And there was an article saying that in Scientific American a few months ago. Yeah. One of the authors was Paul Steinhardt, who was one of the originators of inflation. And now there is this letter in Scientific American. 33 people signed it. It includes Ed Witten, Stephen Hawking, Steve Weinberg. It's all these stars of physics denouncing that critique of inflation and insisting that inflation is a testable theory and is doing just fine and is popular for a good reason.
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that, and I actually caught your column, I think, shortly after it was posted when I was catching up on them. And I mean, I thought, Steinhardt and his co-authors' critique was great. And I mean, to me, it's very persuasive that all you have to do is tweak the initial conditions and some other things, and you can basically say that any universe that we find ourselves in could have been produced by inflation. It's unconstrained. And then I didn't really follow the rebuttal that, it didn't persuade me that it is very constrained and we're testing it. And in that last line, empirical science lives on, and which you referred to as whistling past the graveyard.
Yes.
What does that expression mean? I mean, I know it's a thing, and it occurred to me when I read that I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't good.
Oh, well, it's I'm not sure where I picked it up. It's whistling past the graveyard is being in a state of denial. You're trying to be jaunty and cheerful when actually deep down you are feeling enormous dread.
Yeah, you're going to be in the graveyard at some point, no matter what.
Right. Yeah,
I see. Okay.
Hey, but listen, I really want to hear about your trip especially your trip to Argentina. And, and your visit to this zoo.
It's been that long since we talked. God, I mean, that was early last year.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, I just read.
It took forever. The article didn't come out until the end of last year. So just to give some background, I wrote a long 7,000 word magazine article about the issue of non-human personhood, and the idea that there's some sensible argument that non-humans deserve some kind of rights under the law, and some animal rights lawyers have been trying to establish that by filing a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of a chimpanzee or an orangutan, trying to get a judge to grant, habeas corpus is basically show me the body, and it's an ancient legal principle in which a government imprisoning someone on demand with a writ of habeas corpus has to produce the prisoner and justify that there's a legal reason for the imprisonment. Mm-hmm. And they figure if they can get a judge to say, I'll grant your writ of habeas corpus, then they're implicitly granting that chimps or orangutans or whatever have personhood, that they're persons in the legal sense, in which Monsanto is a person under the law, corporations. And so it was just kind of an opportunity to explore this theme using two habeas corpus cases that had been filed in Argentina, one for an orangutan in Buenos Aires and one for a chimpanzee in Mendoza. Both animals were in the zoo, and the second writ actually succeeded, and the judge granted this, and so I followed up with a piece in Undark that you saw, I think.
Yeah, it was beautifully written. You are a great, among other things, travel writer. You really have an eye for the detail. And I think my favorite line was where you're describing the orangutan, and noting how noting that it's kind of shyly peering out at the rest of the zoo, and you say this was an animal I could identify with.
Yeah, it was quiet. The chimpanzees were annoying. They reminded me of all the bullies in physical education class, and the hyena jackals, and human jackals or non-jackal something. Anyway, so thank you. I appreciate that. It was fun to write. It was a big saga editorially, but it finally appeared.
And the philosophical issues are actually really deep. I felt like you were being journalistically pretty cautious in where you came down. What do you think about the case for personhood on the part of these primates?
I mean, as with everything, I go back and forth. But people who know me know that I'm not exactly an animal person. I don't even particularly like animals. And, I mean, there's certain individual animals, non-human animals, that I've liked, certain cats, certain dogs. But, in general, I'm not an animal person. So, but, when you really start thinking about this and talking to people, and especially this impassioned judge in Buenos Aires, Elena Liberatore, perfect name, the liberator, I see the argument that, we've had animal welfare laws for years, but, these are all based on, just to back up a little, what fascinated me was that our legal system, our Western legal system, whether it's the one deriving from British common law or from French civil law, the so-called Napoleonic Code, basically recognized two, I guess you'd call them ontological categories. There are people and there are things, and so people and property. And the only real way, and people, or I should say persons, have rights. And, over the centuries, our concept of rights has gone from this very narrow thing where it was only white men who owned property and expanded to include all humans, women, all races. Basically, it's broadened generation by generation. And now there's this argument that maybe we need to expand it further to include at least what we perceive as the most intelligent primates. So, but the counter argument being that we already have animal welfare laws, but the animal welfare laws still are predicated on looking at animals as things. They don't grant them any rights. And of course, the animals wouldn't be able to exercise their rights because they wouldn't know they have them. But I think there's an argument to be made that animal welfare laws have not been very successful. And the only way that humans are going to have the leverage in order to really give more protections to other sentient beings is by agreeing that they have some kind of inherent right, personhood, right to live on the earth in the way that's natural to them. And so I can see that. And I could almost even see why in India and other places, rivers have been granted personhood. The idea that, maybe the river has a right to have its own water. And I don't think anyone believes the river is, flowing away, thinking, I've been liberated. But it's a device. It's a device that environmentalists can then use to say, rivers aren't there just so people can extract the maximum amount of water for development, but that, the river has a certain right to maintain its flow. So maybe it's too convoluted, but I toward the end of the article, I think you can see that I became sympathetic to it. And
yeah, I've been writing about something. So I think I've told you I'm working on this book on the mind-body problem, and it's taken me in all these really weird directions. And I was just writing a little section on individuality, and sort of the notion that each of us, in spite of all the changes that we go through, have some kind of core that distinguishes us from every other sentient creature. Yeah. and I realized, this is, I think most people agree that this is true of all humans, but I have these unusual experiences with animals, and especially with birds, because my ex-wife used to rehabilitate wild birds, and so I've lived really up close with lots of wild birds. And one of the things that is really wonderful but also very disconcerting is that you get to know these birds. I mean, for example, for a while we had I think it was 7 little baby blue jays living in the house. So they were rescued when they were really tiny. And then they just grew up, and they're flying all around the house. And you can distinguish slight differences in the personalities of all the birds. There's kind of a blue jay personality, but then there are minor differences. One would be a little more reserved, another one would be a little more aggressive, and this is true of other species that we had too.
They're individuals.
They're individuals, and I thought, I don't know if the concept of if the term soul is about this individuality. That also has all this supernatural baggage, but but it's, in a way, I think that the idea of uniqueness, you could see it as a kind of argument for preciousness, right? But it's disconcerting if you think that it's a virtually infinite number of creatures that have that kind of individuality and are thus possibly worthy of trying to save.
Yeah.
Not just humans.
No. Yeah, one idea that I came around to writing this, and I wanted to get it out there early on in the article, was that this is basically not a scientific argument.
Yeah.
I think most people probably assume, including scientists and people who actually know this stuff, that there's a hierarchy of consciousness. That, maybe, the primates at the top, and then, going down, and somewhere along there, it gets so much less and less like what we really think of consciousness that it's probably a stretch to say that an ant has consciousness, as opposed to, well, maybe the anthill, but still, somewhere along the line, we have to make an arbitrary decision and do a cutoff and say, beyond this point, we're going to, treat these creatures as being not just sentient but conscious. They're not only, they know they're alive, they have concepts of themselves, and we'll never really know. None of the, all of the studies can find evidence supporting that, but you still end up with the unpassable barrier between the subjective and the objective.
Yeah.
And, just like, the argument that you don't really know that anyone else is conscious, but, it's a pretty reasonable working assumption that they are. And it's not just you and the whole, brain and the vat argument. But so the science is never going to decide this. It's something that people have to decide arbitrarily, and therefore we turn to the law and see what that offers us. And we basically have a system that says, well, there's persons, and then there's their stuff. So, the idea of expanding that and adding a third category, which was apparently recently done in French civil law, to recognize sentient beings as being a third category. Yeah.
I noticed that in your Undark article. Undark, is that right? Yeah,
Undark. Yeah, it's named after that paint that was used to radioactive paint. The Radium Girls that they're called. There's a new book by them. These women that were hired, I think, in the 1940s to paint watch dials, like for Bulova and all these watch companies, with glow-in-the-dark paint, which is basically radium plus a substance mixed with the radium that scintillates when the protons from the radium bombard the alpha particles. So, and then they would do things like, lick the brushes or paint on their lips. And one of the brand names for this paint, and got cancer. One of the brand names for this paint was Undark. And Deborah Blum, the science writer who's now the head of the Knight Journalism Fellowship Program at MIT, she and some people there decided they wanted to start a publication about science and science writing, and they decided to call it Undark.
It's a very evocative name.
Yeah.
Well, so in your Undark essay, you mention that there are some biologists who trace, who are even speculating that there might be some kind of consciousness in insects, even with their very primitive nervous systems. And it just occurs to me that there are two really contradictory strands of thought about consciousness right now. So, as the extreme case of saying that consciousness is ubiquitous, there are people, and you and I have talked a little bit about this. Who say not only that bugs are conscious, but that maybe everything is conscious. Maybe that river you were talking about is conscious. Maybe a single proton has a little flicker of consciousness.
Like Thomas Nagel's idea that that maybe there is some basic ingredient that we have not yet embraced in our science, and that's why we keep coming up against a wall when we try to explain consciousness. And maybe at some point we have to figure out, or find, or argue anyway, that there's some other essence, and it's sort of like psychons or conscious stuff, and he doesn't use that term, but that all forms of matter, maybe through some quantum properties, would have some degree of the stuff called consciousness. And he doesn't specifically argue for a quantum thing, but it's more like this idea that how do we know that all of the basic things, space, time, mass, and energy, on which all of our science is based, how do we know that we're not leaving out some really big ingredient? And maybe the clue that we are is that consciousness seems to be inexplicable.
I think he's right, but I actually am disturbed by panpsychism. I wrote a column last fall, I think this is since the last time we talked, coining this term called neo-geocentrism.
Oh yeah, I remember that.
I think of it, it's maybe a more appropriate term would be anthropocentrism or neo-anthropocentrism, because I feel as though panpsychism and there are various other theories that postulate that consciousness is somehow intrinsic to reality. Yeah. It's really crucial to reality. This is part of Wheeler's id from bit idea and the participatory universe. And I see this as it's a projection of human traits onto the rest of the universe, even the inanimate universe, that I don't think is so great. But I actually tell me what you think. I'm getting pushback on that.
Yeah, because you see it, just the inverse way. I mean, you're not saying human consciousness, but you're saying, in a way, it's the opposite of putting people at the center of the universe. It's saying that, everything, including, matter, in the furthest reaches of space and cosmic dust, that all of this stuff, by virtue of being matter, has some degree of this consciousness stuff, which, something like color charge and quantum chromodynamics or electrical charge, that it's some kind of explicable, physical thing, nothing mystical about it, that we just don't understand,
Well, that's what the panpsychists and the neo-geocentrists argue. And
not neo-geocentrism. We're not putting, the panpsychists aren't saying, human consciousness is this, they're not exalting it and putting it at the center of the universe. In a way, they're sort of lowering it down to the same level, as matter and energy. Well, it's just...
let me put it this way. What if we had a theory that said, and, there are people who say things like that the whole universe is alive. It's a giant... It's some kind of giant organism. Yeah. I think most people would see that as grossly anthropocentric. So I don't see why it's not equally anthropocentric to say that consciousness pervades the entire universe. It isn't just a property unique to certain kinds of biological stuff right here on Earth, as far as we know. But anyway, I
don't see it that way. But I for other reasons, I find it suspicious. But again, I'm more sympathetic to panpsychism just because there's no real compelling. Well, there's equally uncompelling alternatives. Maybe it's just everything's up for grabs when it comes to explaining consciousness.
Well, so here's the other extreme position. So you've got on one hand, everything is conscious.
Yeah.
And on the far other pole, you've got Daniel Dennett saying that consciousness is an illusion. And I think you have now read this new book of his. I know we've talked a little bit about Dennett's position before. I've always really been puzzled by it. Yeah, there it is. Yeah, I've got my copy here somewhere too.
Yeah, pull up both of them. Yeah, at the same time.
I don't know where I left it. It's here somewhere. But I was really determined to read this book and figure out what the hell Dennett was talking about, because obviously he's brilliant. He's a very clever philosopher who enjoys provoking people. Some ways, in some cases, in ways that are really instructive, that help you see through the obfuscations and see things more clearly. I came away from reading his book thinking that this idea of consciousness as an illusion is really muddled. And I think it comes from him not liking the idea that consciousness remains this big mystery, that it allows certain kinds of mysticism to persist, and therefore he's trying to degrade consciousness into a minor problem that actually he thinks has been pretty much solved. So I'm just curious what your take is.
Yeah, I almost the opposite of that. I mean, first I should say I saw Dan Wednesday evening.
Oh.
He was in Santa Fe, and I just briefly said hello while he was. This was the presentation. He wrote this book where he worked with a researcher. It had the word pulpit in the title. Do you know what I'm referring to? Wait, let me look up the name. Just A Caught in the Pulpit that he wrote with Linda Lascola, and they interviewed clergy people. Whether Catholic, Jewish, and Protestant, and I can't remember how broadly they reached, if they include Buddhists and Hindus. But anyway, the idea was to go out and look for religious people, religious leaders who were having crises of belief, and then just to interview them and just about how they dealt with the contradictions between religion and science and things like this. Anyway, then the next step in the story is the cognitive scientist Michael Gazzaniga.
Yeah.
His daughter wrote a play based on these interviews. And so the Santa Fe Institute here in town put on this presentation at the Lensic Theater in which Gazzaniga's daughter was there, and she had some local actors, and they put on excerpts from this play, and the spotlight was on them. And then the spotlight would go to the other side of the stage, where David Krakauer, the new president of the Santa Fe Institute, was interviewing Michael Gazzaniga and Daniel Dennett about the science of consciousness. So, and I just caught up with him, briefly in the lobby just to say hello. And he was at the Santa Fe Institute a few years ago as they call it a Miller Scholar, and so I got to talk to him more back then. But anyway, I thought that was interesting since I knew we were going to be talking about the book. But I mean, to me, Dennett is the one person who's come closest to coming up with a plausible account of how you can sort of see how consciousness could be explained in a non-mystical manner. And the idea, he's not saying it's an illusion in the sense that, it doesn't exist or that it's not important. It's an illusion. He calls it a user illusion, right? And the first person I remember using the term user illusion was that Danish science writer, Tor Nordström.
Right.
I think his was called the user illusion.
I think it was.
And the whole idea is, all this cacophony going on in our brains and all of these neural signals going back and forth, things that we don't have access to, or want to, or need to have access to, any more than we want to have access to all of the mechanisms of digestion. All of this stuff going on in our brain. And on top of this, we sort of evolved this higher software level, just to grasp for a metaphor. And it's very much like on our computers when you have the user illusion that you're looking at a desktop and you can drag folders around and put folders into folders. And it's a very compelling illusion, but it's not imaginary. It's basically a nice shorthand, higher level of abstraction way to, sort of compress all of this stuff going on behind the scenes in your computer that you don't want or need to know about into some useful way that you can navigate through the computer world. And he's basically saying consciousness is sort of this first-person simulation that rides on top of all of this brain parallel cacophony, and that this is a way to think about consciousness. It's like, the first-person perspective, and it's illusory in the sense that it's, not real in the way that, the table here is real or the chair here is real, but you can see how something like that would evolve just to bring animals to a higher level in which they can plan and have ideas and discuss ideas and store information and it's the same argument he made way back in Consciousness Explained, which I reviewed at the time for the New York Times book review, and I was just blown away by. I read that book and it's kind of like, wow, I can really see how someone can almost get to the point where you can understand consciousness. It's sort of an information, but not quite. And in his book, I think Dennett, even though he can, come off as sounding, very, very assured and charging forth but he describes this as a sketch of a theory. He describes it as being kind of a grasping toward a theory. So I don't think he's overselling it at all. And to me, it's just sort of brings together, just decades of research by all these cognitive scientists and computer scientists into sort of a compelling story that you can actually get, regular people like me to sort of understand. So to me, that's a huge accomplishment.
Well, see, the problem that I have with it, and I think other people have with it. So Thomas Nagel wrote a pretty scathing review for the New York Review of Books.
Oh no, it wasn't scathing at all.
Oh, I don't know. By the end, he basically just said that Dennett was wrong and he was missing the most important part of consciousness, which is the experiential component, the qualia, and all that. So here's the problem that I have with Dennett. Everything that you just described is about the functions of our mind, and so we've known forever, basically, that there's all this stuff going on below the level of our consciousness of which we're unaware, nor should we be aware. Dennett has this wonderful phrase, competence without comprehension. And that's vital to our survival, both when it comes to metabolism and digestion and a lot of stuff that's going on in our brains. God forbid that we should have to consciously control all the things that are required just to, take a stroll through the park. And even when it comes to consciousness itself, Dennett is describing it as a kind of model building function, and we build models of these things out there in the world that are very cartoonish compared to what's actually out there. We have a model of ourselves that also is this very cartoonish representation of what was really going on within us. But it's conceivable that you could create computer programs that perform similar functions of focusing attention on all this different information that's being processed and creating little models, these sort of icons that are used to represent hideously complicated phenomena. And that doesn't explain the experiential part. So this is what David Chalmers was talking about back in the early 90s when he said that consciousness is different from all these other problems that are posed by the mind that are basically problems of function.
Yeah.
And you can explain those in terms of how evolution or why evolution would produce them, what purpose they serve, and then you can explain them in terms of what's going on in the brain. But that leaves aside, what is it like? What does it feel like to be a human? What does it feel like to be a bat, which is what Thomas Nagel wrote about? So, I mean, this debate between Dennett and his critics has been going on for decades now, and I feel as though both sides are. I feel like at this point, Dennett is the one who's sort of evading the central points of the critics more than the other way around. Yeah,
well, it depends on how persuasive you find the qualia argument. You know, the idea. I mean, color is really a user illusion. There's not color out in the world. There isn't red and there isn't blue and there isn't yellow. There are atoms, vibrating, and there's light, different frequencies, and these frequencies, this light of different frequencies impinges on receptors in our eyes, and we convert it to neuroelectrical signals, and then instead of just sensing all of these vibrations, we sort of sum over it and glom it together and grab it into something called red and blue. So that's like the desktop icons. It's like a user illusion, and that seems like a plausible way to think about color. And and then you go from color into other things, these qualities that we perceive in the world that aren't really in the world, and then consciousness is sort of like a super advanced, complicated version of that.
Yeah,
I mean that to me is as strong and persuasive an argument as is Nagel's argument, which I also find very persuasive, that consciousness is just basically, we're just up against a wall trying to explain it, and therefore we should think about maybe our sciences needs to be expanded, not by becoming mystical, but by seriously considering the idea that in addition to energy, matter, mass, energy, mass, time, and space, these sort of fundamentals, that there's this other thing that would suddenly make sense, or maybe not suddenly, but it would make sense of subjective experience and consciousness. I find both of these arguments really compelling. And so to me, it's like this debate, which was just all over the place throughout history, has kind of converged on these two views of panpsychism, versus it's some kind of computational thing in a Dennett-like manner, or you just kind of step back and be what do they call the new Mysterians, like Cullen McGinn, and you say, consciousness is basically inexplicable. I find that very compelling too.
Yeah, right. Okay. Well, now I thought we were pretty far apart, but I think I agree with everything that you just said. Although you spoke of convergence, I see the field as kind of blowing up. We both went to the consciousness conference a year ago in Tucson, and I just was struck by just the sheer multiplicity of views that people had on consciousness, and how it seemed as though there was nothing that was so far out that it wasn't being entertained by somebody. And I guess the problem with the way that Dennett presents his view is that he's trying to get people to see that consciousness is not that big a mystery anymore, if you look at it in the right way. And I actually think that would be a mistake, because I think that that you can agree that consciousness, that the conscious part of our lives, our ability to sort of introspect, scrutinize ourselves, figure out what's going on out there in the world through conscious perception, that we vastly overrate it. And we are subject to all sorts of forces that are, of which we are totally unconscious. But, Freud talked about that as well. And in fact, it's interesting to me that Freud is usually disparaged by modern scientists and philosophers, gets a shout out from Dan Dennett in his new book. And so I'm not a Mysterian in the sense that I certainly don't think that scientists and philosophers should throw up their hands and give up trying to figure out what the hell is going on. But I like the philosophers like Nagel and Chalmers who are getting us to deepen our appreciation of just how serious a mystery consciousness is, how central it is.
Yeah. But then the counter view would be that they're just sort of wallowing in the mystery, which is not what I think. I think Nagel and Chalmers are both great, and and again, I'm as sympathetic to the panpsychism kind of argument, if it's a non-mystical version, is ever to be found, as I am to the idea that it's some computational thing, like the Dennett model or the Dennett sketch of a model. But I don't know. I guess deep down, I don't really believe that either of those schools of thought is ever going to explain it in a way that there's going to be any kind of consensus or people are going to suddenly say, wow, so that's what consciousness is,
right.
Sort of in the way that people reacted to Watson and Crick with the double helical model of DNA. And we just kind of go, yeah, I can see now what life is. And even though it's still pretty damn mysterious life, but you have this way to think about it. So I kind of doubt that that's going to happen. So I guess that makes me a Mysterian. And then there's my whole thing about, I just think it's strange that humans assume that we have the cognitive processing power to understand the universe when, we're just one little part of the universe, and this, one twig over from, chimpanzees and apes on the evolutionary tree. We evolved on the third rock on the sun. We don't know if there's anything like us in the universe, or if it's, life, consciousness is ubiquitous. We don't know any of this stuff, and yet we assume that we've got it all figured out. We can say the Big Bang happened 13.8, and there's even a few more decimal points in there, billion years ago, and there's just this hubris to this that makes me really like when people like Nagel in his recent book to say, hey, maybe we don't know it all. So it's like so anthropocentrism is the idea that we're in the center of the universe. Geocentrism, the Earth is in the center of the universe. But in a way, this idea that our science and time has reached the point where now, in the year 2017, we have all the basic pieces, and we can use these to explain consciousness, the origins of the Big Bang, cosmological inflation, all of this. And there's got to be a point in which it's beyond the ability of the human brain. And maybe there'll be other brains somewhere in the universe, or maybe future brains, maybe science in 2517 we'll have more basic components and so whatever that all comes down to.
I've been thinking about some of the old rhetoric of the Santa Fe Institute, the heyday of complexity back in the late 80s and early 90s, for two reasons. I'm writing about Stuart Kaufman once again for this book I'm working on, and
I had dinner with Stuart and Kate last night.
Oh wow! Okay,
well, a week this one. He just lives up the hill from me.
Yeah, well, I knew he had a home in Santa Fe, so I assume he gave you a sense of the ideas that he's thinking about. He's still trying to figure out where the hell did this all come from? What explains all these amazing patterns and emergent phenomena in the universe, and especially life and conscious, intelligent life that's even capable of asking these sorts of questions. I also recently had a Q&A with Stephen Wolfram, who's this extraordinary figure who was doing work within the field of complexity at a very young age. He's this polymath. He's got this legendary, extremely high intelligence. Was writing articles about particle physics, I think, when he was still in his teens, and then split off from academia and created Mathematica and became like a mogul. But now he is, I saw him give a talk at NYU. I forget exactly when this was, sometime last year, and I asked him if he'd do a Q&A, and actually, somewhat to my surprise, he agreed. And he thinks that these models he's working on, cellular automata, still have the power to transform science.
Yeah,
and these were things.
His book, A New Kind of Science.
Yeah. So
I find it fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, his book it got some pretty harsh reviews from the kind of people who would be qualified to pass judgment on him. Like Steven Weinberg wrote a very critical review of Wolfram's book for the New York Review of Books.
So someone who was completely unqualified to pass on the quality of the book, which was myself, wrote a rave review of it in the New York Times Book Review. So,
is that right?
Yeah,
I must have known that.
Emails from some of my Santa Fe Institute friends who have had various bitter disputes with Wolfram. But I just think it's fascinating. Again, it's another way of carving up reality using this idea of a digital science with the cellular automata rather than differential equations. And I just think it's a great book.
Yeah, I guess the question is, I wrote about these things in The End of Science 20 years ago, and I concluded that it was a lot of smoke, nothing of substance there. But I'm becoming more, I don't know, I'm getting soft in my old age. I'm beginning to think maybe some of this stuff will pan out in the future. Some of these ideas.
I'm sorry I interrupted you, but...
Well, I was just going to say...
There's people like Stephen Wolfram and Stuart Kauffman who are really, they're really determined to come up with a theory of everything. And their two views could hardly be more different. And yet, you're sitting at the dinner table last night with Stuart and his wife Kate and his son Ethan. And Stuart, he's just as animated and as animated by this stuff as ever, and sees it as the next step beyond complexity and things he started writing about early on in his book The Origins of Order, and then At Home in the Universe, and Investigations with his Wittgensteinian title, and now he's taking it another step with he's talking about doing a new book on this. And he had very nice to say about you, by the way. He's saying, I'm so glad that John and I have become friends after all these years. And he said, John is really brilliant, His rapier wit, even when it is directed at oneself, is just so impressive.
He must have had a few drinks by then. That's very kind of him to say. But, I guess I'm becoming sort of like, usually I use the term postmodernism to beat people over the head, but I think I'm seeing postmodernism in a more positive light, that when it comes to the mind and free will, the sort of central mysteries of the human condition, what makes for a good life, how should we treat other animals, that the idea of there being a kind of perfect optimal solution to these sorts of questions doesn't seem to be viable anymore, but we shouldn't see that as defeat. It just means we need lots of ideas. We have to keep rediscovering these problems and coming up with more solutions. So that's my kind of happy face philosophy these days.
But we're both in our 60s now, and we've both been kind of science fans without being scientists, and writing about science and science critics in some sense. And And after all these decades, I mean, you look back and you see all of the excitement, like in the 1980s, over artificial intelligence and even neural networks and things that, they become exciting again, but still the idea that, this is going to result in, finally understanding what consciousness is and the mind-body problem, how the mind arises from the brain. It's really just as mysterious as ever, even though I do think it's kind of, focused into a couple schools of thought. And then just basic disappointments, like thinking that we were going to be all over the solar system by now with our space program, and then mostly understanding mind-brain problem, but developing, a true artificial intelligence indistinguishable from a human intelligence. I still think that'll probably happen sooner than later in the terms of eons, but I don't know. It's just you really get a sense that nothing seems new anymore.
Okay.
People have been working on this stuff, and sometimes the technology becomes advanced, but as far as true understanding, is the universe algorithmic or non-algorithmic? And Stewart is quite sure it's non-algorithmic. And then, but you have people who believe in the deep Turing principle that all reality can be described conceivably by a computer program. With given an arbitrary amount of resources, energy and memory space and all of that it all is basically explicable. And and it gets down to whether scientific materialism can explain everything, and prove that there's not an edge beyond which it can't go. And you kind of get to an age where you realize, no, none of that stuff is ever going to be proven. People are going to keep plugging away at it, and there'll be new books that sort of repeat ideas and rediscover ideas from old books and expand them in some cases or go backwards. And it's both discouraging and exhilarating at the same time.
But George, what about big data?
There was at the beginning, the first day of our science writing workshop, we go up to the Santa Fe Institute and hear from some of their people. And David Krakauer, the new president, gave a brief introduction. And when he does this, he does these wonderful riffs, where I don't think he even knows what he's going to say until he walks into the room. But around the room, in the conference room there now, they have these pictures, and they're images of famous equations like Maxwell's equation and Planck's quantum, the original expression of the quantum, and then David was kind of riffing on the difference between these compressions, where you have these, all of this reality being boiled down to this simple equation that you can have on a picture on the wall in this conference room, and then big data, in which you have the sprawl, and you have deep neural networks of many layers of artificial neurons, and we don't really know what they're doing exactly. I mean, now we have to have theories of what the neural network is doing as it perceives, these different patterns. Just like we have theories about what the brain is doing, and so we're getting to the point where we're building artifacts that people will disagree over how or whether they work. And this came up last night talking to Stewart, this whole thing with, the company in Canada that claims it has a quantum computer. And they've built one, but there's this huge debate over whether it's really working, according to quantum mechanical principles, or if it's just a classical computer built in a weird way. The D-Wave is the company. So, I mean, so that's kind of the interesting thing about big data, just this whole idea that we're to the point where maybe we've done everything we can do as far as reducing to basic principles, and from now on it's all just going to be computer algorithms finding patterns in huge amounts of data, sometimes in ways that we don't really understand, and then we have to try to understand the computers.
We need models of the models.
Models of the models of the models. And
yeah.
Kind of, I mean, it's sort of the flavor of Dennett's view of consciousness. It's a model of a model of a model. It's models all the way down.
Right.
Until you reach the turtles.
Right. Hey, we've covered an hour.
Oh, okay, great.
So
I wanted to bring up one last thing.
Sure.
Do you have plans for the solar eclipse in August?
I wasn't even, I'm sorry to say, I wasn't even aware of the solar eclipse.
There's going to be a total solar eclipse visible coast to coast in the United States.
Wow.
And if you look for NASA's map, and you can see the band. So for me to see the total solar eclipse, I sort of knew about this, and then a few weeks ago I was exchanging emails with my friend Faye Flam, the science writer for Bloomberg.
Sure, yeah.
In one of her new columns in Bloomberg View, kind of made a passing reference to the solar eclipse as far as, how we have this science that can predict, even that there's going to be a total solar eclipse on August 22 visible from these certain positions. And I thought, oh, God, I haven't made any arrangements, but thank God it's not until August. So then I looked on the map and saw that the closest place that I can see the total eclipse is around Casper, Wyoming, due north from Santa Fe. And then I started looking, searching hotels, and it turns out that every single motel, campground, everything within the band of the solar eclipse has already been booked. And the closest I could find, which is 150 miles away in Cheyenne, Wyoming, was a Days Inn motel, and they were charging $350 for one night the night before the eclipse, which I reserved because it's the only thing. So I'm kind of, I wanted to make sure you start making plans. You'll have to go down to Virginia to see it.
Well, I was just checking my date book. I'm going to be in Nantucket on August 22nd.
Oh, way too far north.
Way too far north?
Virginia.
Yeah.
West Virginia. Oh, you can't miss a total solar eclipse.
I just remember there was a total solar eclipse, and I think it was 1971, and it started just as I had to play an indoor hockey game. It was for the championship of Connecticut, and so I missed it. I remember I was in my car. I drove to this stadium, and I could just see a little bite out of the sun. It was a beautiful, clear day. A little bite out of the sun as I had to walk into the arena. So,
and it was a total?
I think so.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I part of the reason I'm saying this is I'd like to take advantage of our Blogging Heads viewers and just ask if any viewers somewhere in the western portion of the total eclipse band, preferably in Wyoming or western Nebraska, if they have any advice on where I can find a place to stay the night before the eclipse. I would be grateful if they would contact me by email. And they
That's a great idea.
Address on my website. And right now my plan is I'm going to drive up to Cheyenne, Wyoming the day before, which is about 500 miles, stay at the $350 a night Days Inn. The rate for the next day is $78. And then get up really early in the morning, and then if I drive, once I get 100 miles north of Cheyenne, I'll be within the band of totality. And if I go another 50 miles, I'll be in the place where for 2.5 full minutes, it'll be a full total eclipse. So, but I'm imagining that there's going, this might be like this historical mass migration where there's going to be thousands of people jamming the highways and people abandoning their cars. And, I never occurred to me before, but the fact that you have a total solar eclipse visible, from East Coast to West Coast in the United States is just an extraordinary development.
Wow. I feel really ignorant.
Oh, I didn't
even aware. Good for you, George. You are hardcore. You are a real science guy.
Oh, I can't miss this. I mean, there's going to be another one in 5 years, I think, that's visible in North America, but nothing like this.
Well, I hope the Blogging Heads people come through for you.
I hope so too. And I'm not saying I won't pay money. It's. I mean, if I had a $350 motel room within the band of totality, so I didn't have to drive the next day and risk, getting into a solar eclipse traffic jam, I'd totally do it. But one of the complicating factors is that I can't remember which group it is, American Astronomical Society, some astronomical society organization is having their big annual convention during that week in Casper. And of course they planned this. I learned about this from Alec Whitsey, a friend who's a science writer. She does a lot of their astronomy stuff for Nature Journal. And she said, "Oh yeah, she and her husband, who's also an astronomy writer, said, yeah, we made, everyone made reservations more than a year ago, and the hotels have been booked up for a year because of this. Wow. This is probably, it's probably one. I mean, there's no telling, but the further west you go, well, until you get toward the coast, it's probably more likely you'll have clear skies. So that's why I figure Casper is really good. North Platte, Nebraska is." It's another town in Nebraska that's right in the band. So people who live there, I mean, it's just amazing. But anyway, I'm getting all excited about this.
Yeah, good luck.
You Airbnb and all these people offering, eclipse venues, but they're all solidly booked. Like $2,000 to spend, to rent our house, in Casper, Wyoming for one night, and it's booked.
And how long does it last? Like 15 minutes?
About 2.5 minutes, the totality. But the like the eclipse itself is longer.
Yeah.
I don't have the exact figure here. This was a really cool map that NASA has. It shows the band, and you can actually click anywhere within the band, and it gives you a little balloon telling you the latitude and longitude and what the duration of the eclipse will be and the duration of totality. And yeah.
I'll check it out.
It's going to be awesome.
Right.
Even more awesome than Nantucket.
I'm sure. Okay, we'll have to talk again after that happens. Yeah. You can tell us all about it.
Yeah.
And I hope you find some really good cheap place. Although I don't know, the Days Inn sounds
cheap. Doesn't even have to be cheap, but within reason. But $350 a night for a crummy motel room would be fine if it's within the band and not 150 miles south. Or maybe somebody's
good.
Yeah, maybe even if somebody has a place where I can sleep in my car and park in their driveway, I do it. Science.
Yeah. All right, George. Well, good luck, and Thanks. It was great talking to you.
You too. Let's do it again soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. Adios.
Yeah.
Oh.